I was about to blow out the candles on my 70th birthday cake when I heard words no mother should ever have to hear. They slipped out in a whisper, so soft they were never meant for my ears. After tonight, we'll finally have the house to ourselves. I froze. The knife in my hand trembled above the cake, and the laughter around me blurred into a distant hum. In that instant, I knew the life I had lived, the sacrifices I had made, had all led to this moment of truth. But before I tell you what happened, let me introduce myself. My name is Roseanne. I'm 70 years old, a widow, and a mother of one. And if you're listening to my story right now, I want to know where you're watching from. Are you sitting in your living room with a cup of tea? Are you listening late at night, maybe alone, the way I often find myself? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know. Because you see, stories like mine aren't just about me. They're about all of us. Women who've lived long enough to see joy, pain, loyalty, and betrayal woven together in ways we could never have imagined. Now let me take you back a little. I live in the same house my husband and I bought nearly 50 years ago. It's not a grand house by anyone's standards, but it's the kind of place that remembers everything. The floorboards creak where my son used to run as a little boy. The garden still blooms with the roses my husband planted before he passed. And every corner carries a memory, both sweet and heavy. I never remarried after my husband died. Some people told me I should, but I couldn't. My world became about raising my son, Daniel. He was only 12 when his father passed, and I promised myself I'd do whatever it took to see him grow into a man who could stand tall on his own. So I worked. Long hours, odd jobs, whatever I could find. My hands grew stiff, my back ached, but I never complained. Every penny went to keeping Daniel fed, clothed, and educated. And when he graduated college, I remember thinking, it was worth it. Every sacrifice was worth it. Now, 70 years on this earth leaves a person with plenty of memories. Some of them shine bright, like when Daniel would bring me flowers from the yard as a little boy. Others weigh heavy, like the long nights when I cried myself to sleep, too exhausted to keep going, yet knowing I had no choice. And still, through it all, I held on to this home, because it was our anchor. It was the one place Daniel could always come back to. That's why, when my birthday came around, I was filled with hope. The house was warm, with relatives, neighbors, and the faint smell of candles waiting to be lit. My son and his wife, Laura, had organized the evening, or so it seemed. I watched Daniel, now a grown man, helping set the plates, while Laura moved briskly through the kitchen, her smile polished but distant. I told myself not to overthink it. Families change, marriages bring new dynamics, and sometimes warmth turns into routine. But I still expected that tonight, on my 70th birthday, there would be a little tenderness, a little recognition of the years I had poured into building this life. The moment came when everyone gathered around the table. The cake was set in front of me. Chocolate, my favorite, though I had told no one. I leaned in, ready to blow out the candles, when I heard it. A whisper. Daniel's voice so close I almost thought I had imagined it. After tonight, we'll finally have the house to ourselves. At first I thought maybe he meant the guests. Perhaps he was simply tired, eager for the house to be quiet again. But then I saw the look in Laura's eyes. She nodded, satisfied, as though something had been settled. That's when my hand froze. The knife hovered over the cake, the wax dripping from the candles. But I couldn't move. A chill swept over me, deeper than the arthritis in my bones, sharper than any pain I had known. They thought I wouldn't hear. They thought my age had dulled my senses. But in that moment, I heard them clearly. And I understood. I smiled, steadying my hand, and blew out the candles while everyone clapped. Yet inside, something had shifted. My birthday had become more than a celebration. It had become a turning point, because they didn't know what I had already prepared for them. The applause faded, and I cut the cake with hands steadier than I felt. Plates passed around, forks clinked, and laughter filled the dining room. But inside me, something had gone terribly still. That whisper wouldn't leave my ears. After tonight, we'll finally have the house to ourselves. It replayed over and over, each time cutting a little deeper. At first, I told myself I had misheard. Surely Daniel couldn't have meant it the way it sounded. Surely he hadn't been waiting for me to step aside. Or worse. But then Laura leaned close to him, her hand brushing his, and she gave him that look. A look I'd seen too many times in my life. Partnership, secrecy, something shared that excluded me. My stomach turned. I forced myself to smile as I handed out slices of cake. My niece asked if I'd made my wish when I blew out the candles. I told her I had. But the truth was, my only wish at that moment was clarity. Clarity about whether my son, my only child, had truly just wished me gone. After the cake, conversations broke off into smaller clusters. The younger ones gathered in the living room, laughing at some story on the television. The older women sat at the dining table, sipping tea. I stayed standing for a while, watching Daniel. He avoided my gaze, busying himself with the empty plates. Laura, however, didn't bother. Her eyes flicked toward me once, sharp, calculating, then moved away. I walked into the kitchen, needing air. And sure enough, a moment later, Laura followed, carrying 2 plates. She smiled politely. "Lovely party," she said, but her tone was flat, almost rehearsed. I looked at her, my voice calm. "Do you feel at home here, Laura?" She blinked, surprised. "Of course," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "Why wouldn't I?" I smiled faintly, though my chest tightened. I just wonder sometimes. This house carries so much history. Not everyone is comfortable with that. Her lips curved into a polite smile, but her eyes hardened. "Well, Daniel and I are making our own history now. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, but inside, her words sliced through me. Making their own history. I could hear the unspoken end of that sentence, without me in it. We stood there for a moment, the silence heavier than the clatter of dishes. Finally, she excused herself, leaving me alone with the whisper still echoing in my ears. I sank into a chair. Memories began to rise unbidden. Nights of overtime at the factory, saving every penny so Daniel could have a proper education. Meals I skipped so he never went hungry. I had given my youth, my strength, my entire heart to that boy. And now, at 70, was I nothing more than a burden in his eyes? But beneath the ache of betrayal, something else began to stir. A quiet strength. A realization. I remembered how, over the past year, there had been signs I had brushed aside. The way Laura insisted on handling the bills, though I'd always done it. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The suggestions, subtle at first, that maybe the house was too much for me now. I thought of one evening just a month earlier. I had mentioned to Daniel that the roof needed repairs. His reply had been sharp, almost impatient. "Mum, you should really think about downsizing. A house this size isn't practical for you anymore." I had laughed it off then, telling myself he was only concerned for me. Now, I wasn't so sure. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, I stood by the door, hugging each one goodbye. My smile never faltered, but my heart had grown heavier with every passing minute. Daniel kissed my cheek distractedly. Laura offered me a thin smile, and together they thanked me for hosting. When the door closed and the house fell quiet, I sat in the living room, staring at the flickering candles that had burned themselves out. The whisper replayed in my mind like a broken record. They thought I was old. They thought I was fragile. They thought I wouldn't hear, wouldn't understand. But they were wrong. That night, I made a promise to myself. They wanted the house to themselves. They wanted my absence to free them. Number. Not yet. Because while they had their whispers, I had something else. I had already begun preparing something they could never have imagined. That night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I sat alone with a pot of tea growing cold beside me. I stared at the empty chairs in the dining room, and the silence pressed down on me like a heavy quilt. I thought about how we had gotten here, how a boy I once carried in my arms could whisper such words about me. When Daniel was 12, his father passed away suddenly from a heart attack. I still remember the phone call from the hospital, the way the receiver nearly slipped from my hand. One minute I was a wife and a mother, and the next I was a widow, clutching my boy as he cried into my chest. From that day forward, my life became about survival. I took whatever work I could find. Sewing for neighbours, cleaning houses, even working nights at a factory where the machines roared louder than my thoughts. My hands grew rough, my knees ached, but I pressed on. Every penny I earned went into keeping Daniel fed, clothed, and educated. There were nights I skipped meals so he could eat properly. Winters when I went without a new coat so he could have one. Birthdays when I couldn't afford toys, so I baked cakes from scratch and lit candles, hoping he wouldn't notice how simple the gifts were. I gave him my whole life. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because when you're a mother, you don't count the cost. But as the years passed, I began to notice how differently Daniel saw those sacrifices. To him, they were invisible, as though food simply appeared on the table, as though clothes stitched themselves. He grew into a man who believed comfort was a given, not a gift. I remember one evening not long ago when I had asked him for help carrying groceries. My knees had been bad that day, swollen like two angry fists. Daniel sighed, his face tight with annoyance. "Mum, you can't keep depending on me for everything," he said sharply. I looked at him, shocked. "Depending on you? Daniel, I've managed this house on my own for nearly 60 years. I only asked you to carry a bag." He rubbed his forehead, muttering, "You should really think about moving somewhere smaller." "You can't keep up with all this." I wanted to tell him the truth, that this house wasn't a burden to me. It was the last piece of my life with his father. It was where I poured every ounce of myself into raising him. But the words caught in my throat, and I let the conversation die in silence. Still, his tone that day lingered with me. It was the first time I felt the faint sting of being seen not as a mother, but as a weight. Another memory came to me that night as I sat in the quiet. Daniel's graduation. I had worked double shifts for months to afford the suit he wore. I stood in the crowd, tears streaming down my face, clapping louder than anyone. Afterward, he hugged me, but when his friends arrived, he stepped away quickly, embarrassed by my tears, embarrassed by my worn shoes and tired clothes. And yet, I never held it against him. I told myself he was young, that he would grow into gratitude with time. But gratitude never came. Now, on the night of my 70th birthday, the pattern was clear. The whisper I had overheard was not a slip of the tongue. It was the truth, finally revealed. I sat back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the photographs on the mantel. Daniel, as a toddler, grinning with chocolate on his cheeks. Daniel at 8, proudly holding a toy car we had saved months to buy. Daniel at 20, standing tall in his graduation gown. I traced each frame with my eyes, remembering the love I had poured into those moments. And yet, the boy in those pictures felt like a stranger now. The kettle had gone cold, but my resolve was only beginning to warm. I whispered to myself, "I have given everything. Now I'll take something back." I didn't yet know exactly how I would do it, but I knew this. I would not go quietly. They thought they were planning for my absence, but I was already preparing for their surprise. And when the time came, Daniel would finally understand the cost of betrayal. The house always feels too quiet after a gathering. The laughter lingers in the walls, but when the last door closes, silence settles in, heavy and sharp. That night, after my birthday, the silence carried more weight than ever. I sat in the living room, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The cake was half eaten on the counter, plates stacked by the sink, crumbs scattered like little reminders of a night that should have been joyful. Daniel and Laura moved about the house, tidying up. Their voices carried softly from the kitchen, too low for me to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Calm, confident, at ease. I thought about that whisper again. After tonight, we'll finally have the house to ourselves. It pulsed in my ears like a drumbeat, drowning out everything else. Finally, I rose from my chair and walked into the kitchen. Laura was drying a plate, Daniel stacking glasses. They both looked up when I entered, and for a moment I saw it. Guilt flickering across my son's face. I leaned against the doorway, my voice steady. "Did you enjoy the party?" Daniel nodded quickly. "Of course, Mum. It was nice to see everyone together." Laura smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, very nice." I let the silence stretch for a moment before I spoke again. I couldn't help overhearing something earlier. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. "Oh? What do you mean?" I looked straight at him. "You said, after tonight, you'd finally have the house to yourselves." The air thickened instantly. Daniel's eyes darted to Laura, whose smile faltered for the briefest second. "You must have misheard," Daniel said quickly, too quickly. "I was just talking about the guests leaving. You know how crowded it gets." I tilted my head. "Is that so?" Funny, because the way Laura nodded made it sound like something else entirely. Laura set the plate down a little too hard. "Roseanne, you're reading too much into things. You're tired." It was a long night. Her tone was clipped, almost patronizing. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I may be 70, I said softly, "but my ears work just fine. And I know when I'm being talked about." Daniel stepped forward, his hands raised slightly, as though to soothe me. "Mum, please, let's not turn this into something it isn't. You've always misunderstood things when you're emotional." Those words stung more than I expected. Misunderstood. That had become their shield, hadn't it? A way to make me doubt myself, to paint me as fragile, confused, easily mistaken. I straightened, my voice sharper now. "Do not dismiss me, Daniel. Not tonight. Not after everything I've done for you." His mouth opened, then closed again. Laura crossed her arms, her jaw tight, eyes fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until finally Daniel muttered, "We'll talk about this another time." I held his gaze. "No, we'll talk about it now." For a moment, no one moved. Then Laura reached for his arm. "Come on, Daniel," she said softly, almost urging. "Leave it. She's just tired." And just like that, they turned, retreating down the hall, leaving me alone in the kitchen. But if they thought I would forget, they were wrong. I stood there, staring at the empty doorway where they had just disappeared. My heart pounded in my chest, but not from fear, from certainty. That whisper was not a slip of the tongue. Their reactions tonight had confirmed it. They wanted me gone. I walked back into the living room, lowering myself into the armchair my husband used to sit in. I let my hands rest on the worn fabric and closed my eyes. "They think I'm weak," I whispered into the silence. "They think I'm blind." But I wasn't weak, and I wasn't blind. They had no idea that while they whispered about my absence, I had already been preparing my presence in a way they could never erase, and the time was coming when they would see exactly what I meant. The next morning, sunlight poured through the lace curtains in the living room, but I felt no warmth from it. I sat at the dining table, a cup of tea cooling beside me, the events of the night before still heavy in my chest. I knew one thing for certain. I could no longer live on assumptions or blind faith. My son's words, and the look in Laura's eyes, had confirmed a truth I could no longer ignore. If they were planning for my absence, I had to prepare for it too. Only in my case, my preparation wouldn't leave me erased. I reached for the telephone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. The office of Mr. Whitaker, our family lawyer. He had handled my husband's affairs after his passing and had always treated me with respect, even when I walked into his office with trembling hands and little money. "Mrs. Price," He greeted warmly when he answered, "It's been some time. What can I do for you?" "I need to talk about my will," I told him, my voice firm. There was a pause on the other end, then a gentle reply, "Of course. Why don't you come in this week?" 2 days later, I found myself sitting in his office, the smell of leather and paper filling the air. I explained everything: my house, my modest savings, the small jewelry box of heirlooms that had belonged to my mother, and then I told him who I wanted it all to go to. Not Daniel, not Laura. Instead, I named my niece, Emily, a young woman who had always been kind to me, who visited without being asked, who never treated me like a burden. And the rest, I instructed, would go to a local charity for widows. Women who, like me, had carried the weight of loss and kept moving forward. Mr. Whitaker looked at me carefully, his pen hovering over the paper. "Are you sure about this, Roseanne?" "These are big decisions," I nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. My son already has what he wants: his life, his wife, his future. But respect? Gratitude? That he doesn't have. And I will not reward betrayal with inheritance." He wrote everything down, his expression sober. "Then we'll make it official." Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting to life. I was shaping it. But Daniel must have sensed something, because that evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, he appeared in the doorway. "Mum?" he said casually, leaning against the frame. "Laura and I were talking. Have you thought about your future? You know, like what you want to do if the house gets too much for you?" I looked up from the neatly folded towels, meeting his eyes. "Funny you should ask. I've been giving it some thought." His face brightened, eager. "Really? And?" I let a small smile play on my lips. "And I have it handled." His brow furrowed. "Handled how?" "Just handled," I replied, returning my gaze to the laundry. "You don't need to worry." For the first time, I saw unease in his eyes. He opened his mouth to press further, but I cut him off gently. "Daniel, there are things a mother doesn't have to explain to her child. Trust me when I say, I know what I'm doing." The silence that followed was thick. I could almost feel the questions burning in his chest, but he said nothing more. He left the room, and I let out a slow breath. He had no idea what I had set in motion. That night, as I tucked the signed papers safely into a folder, I thought of my husband's words from long ago. Never let greed break the home. Greed had already cracked it, but I was determined it would not shatter me, because while they whispered in corners, I was preparing in plain sight. And soon, they would learn that this house, and the woman who built it, were not so easily discarded. It was a week after my birthday when I decided the time had come. The days leading up to it had been quiet, almost too quiet. Daniel and Laura tiptoed around me with polite smiles, as though nothing had happened. But I could feel the tension humming beneath the surface, like a kettle about to whistle. They thought they were clever, hiding their impatience, waiting for me to fade into the background. But I had grown tired of whispers. Tonight, there would be no whispers, only truth. I invited them into the living room after supper. The fire crackled low in the hearth, shadows dancing on the walls. On the coffee table, I had placed a stack of papers neatly inside a folder. I sat in my husband's old armchair, the one that gave me a kind of strength, while they settled across from me on the couch. Daniel looked uneasy, his knee bouncing slightly. Laura, on the other hand, wore that same polished smile, as though she were already in control. I folded my hands in my lap. "We need to talk." Daniel exhaled. "Mom, if this is about the other night—" "It is," I cut in sharply. "And I will not be silenced this time." His mouth snapped shut. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "I heard what you said, Daniel. Clear as day. After tonight, we'll finally have the house to ourselves. Those were your words." Daniel paled. "Mom, Laura jumped in quickly. "She's twisting it, Daniel. You were talking about the guests." I turned to her, my eyes steady. "Do not insult me, Laura. I know what I heard." And I saw your face when you nodded. That was no talk of guests. That was talk of me. Laura's lips thinned, but she said nothing. I let the silence stretch before I reached for the folder on the table. You see, what you didn't know is that I've been making preparations of my own. Daniel frowned. Preparations? I opened the folder, sliding the papers toward them. My will. The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy and cold. Daniel picked up the first page, his eyes scanning it. Slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. This leaves the house to Emily, he stammered. And the savings? To charity? Laura leaned forward, her face flushing. You can't be serious. This house belongs to Daniel. It's his inheritance. No, I said softly but firmly. This house belongs to me, and I decide what becomes of it. Daniel's voice cracked. Mum, after everything I've done for you? I felt heat rise in my chest, and my words came sharp. Everything you've done for me? Daniel? I fed you when I had nothing left to eat. I clothed you when my own shoes were worn through. I worked myself to the bone so you could stand on your own 2 feet. Don't you dare speak to me of what you've done for me. His face flushed, and for a moment he looked like a scolded child again. Laura's eyes blazed. This is selfish, Roseanne. You're punishing us because you misheard a single comment. I shook my head slowly. No, I am protecting what I built with my own hands, what your greed would have devoured. You wanted me gone from this house. Now, you'll get your wish, because when I'm gone, not a brick of it will belong to you. The fire crackled louder, filling the silence. Daniel's hands trembled as he set the papers down. Mum, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please, don't do this. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I didn't see my son. I saw a man who had betrayed the very woman who gave him everything. My voice was steady as I spoke the final words. You wanted freedom from me. Now you'll have it. But not in the way you imagined. The room fell silent. Daniel stared at the floor. Laura's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with fury. But I felt a calmness settle over me, stronger than any storm they could muster. For the first time in a long time, I had taken back control of my life. The night after I showed them the papers, the house was the quietest it had ever been. No whispered laughter from the hallway, no footsteps down the creaking stairs, no clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Just silence, the kind that wraps itself around you and makes you think about every choice you've made. I sat in my armchair, staring at the embers glowing faintly in the fireplace. My hands trembled, but not from fear this time. From release. For years, I had carried the weight of being the giving one, the forgiving one, the one who always bent so others could stand tall. And now, for the first time, I had stood firm. Daniel and Laura didn't speak to me for days. They left in a rush the morning after our confrontation, Laura barely disguising her anger, Daniel avoiding my eyes altogether. The house was still mine, but their absence felt like both a wound and a blessing. In those quiet days, I reflected on everything. How easily years of sacrifice can be forgotten. How quickly love can be overshadowed by greed. And yet I also thought of the strength that surfaces when we're forced to choose between dignity and surrender. Weeks later, Daniel returned. Alone. He knocked softly on the door, and for a moment I considered not answering. But blood is blood, and even a wounded heart beats for its child. I opened the door. He stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes downcast like a boy caught misbehaving. Mum? He said quietly. Can I come in? I stepped aside, letting him enter. He moved slowly, looking around the house as though it had changed, though every detail was the same. The photographs on the mantel, the worn rug by the fireplace, the scent of lavender polish. We sat across from each other in the living room. The silence stretched until he finally spoke. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, he muttered. Laura and I, we were just talking. We didn't mean to hurt you. I studied his face. For a moment, I wanted to believe him, to let those words wash away the sting of betrayal. But I remembered Laura's nod, his eager tone, the months of hints about me downsizing, moving, fading into the background. I shook my head slowly. Daniel, there's no use pretending. You meant it. Maybe not in that exact moment, but in your heart, you meant it. He flinched, his jaw tightening. Mum, I thought it would be easier. For everyone, for you, I corrected gently. Not for me. His eyes glistened, but he said nothing. I leaned forward, my voice firm but calm. A mother forgives, Daniel. I have forgiven you more times than I can count. But a mother also remembers. And betrayal like this, it doesn't disappear with a few soft words. He dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slumping. I'm still your mother, I continued. I will always love you. But love does not mean surrender. And I will not surrender the life I built, the dignity I earned, or the respect I deserve. The words hung between us, heavy but necessary. For the first time, I saw understanding flicker in his eyes. Not full acceptance, not remorse deep enough to undo what had been done, but understanding. When he left that evening, the house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, and thought about the women who might one day hear my story. Women who, like me, had given their lives to their families, only to feel pushed aside in their later years. To you, I say this. Do not let yourself be erased. Do not believe the whispers that tell you you're a burden, or that your time is over. Stand firm. Speak your truth. Hold on to your dignity, because once you give it away, no one will return it to you. We, the women who have lived through decades of love and loss, of sacrifice and strength, deserve better than to be cast aside. We deserve to be remembered not for what we gave up, but for what we stood for. And that night, as the fire warmed my face, I knew I had finally stood for myself. The weeks that followed brought a quiet I had not known in years. Not an empty quiet, but a peaceful one, the kind that lets you breathe without waiting for the next sharp word or hidden glance. I tended my garden again. I polished the family photographs, not with sadness, but with pride. For the first time in decades, I felt like my home was truly mine, not a place I was keeping for someone else, not a weight I carried for the next generation, but a life I had built and chosen to protect. Daniel visits now and then. Sometimes he comes with questions in his eyes, as though searching for a door back into my trust. I open the door to him, but not my resolve. Love remains, but boundaries remain too. That balance is something I should have held long ago. And Laura? She has kept her distance. Perhaps she thinks she lost the battle. But this was never a battle. It was my life, my dignity, and my right to decide how my story would be written. So, to those of you watching, women who have given and given until your bones ached and your hearts carried more than their share, let me tell you this. You do not have to wait for whispers to reveal the truth. You do not have to wait for someone else to decide your worth. Your story is yours to write. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Speak your truth before others write it for you. Protect your dignity as fiercely as you once protected your children. And remember, love may forgive, but it should never surrender. Thank you for listening to my story. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And if you were in my place, what would you have done? Until next time, take care of yourselves and never forget your worth.